Hello and welcome to this video explainer on the National Sports Policy 2025, which was passed by the Indian Cabinet on July 1st, 2025. So this policy is a refresher from the 2001 policy. So first time in 24 years, we have a new sports policy. And in many ways, it is a new vision for Indian sport. This policy establishes a vision without necessarily providing an implementation framework, and we should expect that to come next. So, what is the approach of this policy? The policy is based on five pillars. These are not distinct pillars, but they're essentially five pillars which hold each other up, as well as a larger structure of Indian sport. So, when you look at them, there are five pillars. One is sports excellence, well established and well entrenched as one of the objectives of sports policy. But the other ones are reasonably new. The role of sport in economic development, the role of sport in social development, but also the role of sport as a people's movement, a participatory movement. And finally, perhaps the most critical one, just harmonizing the national sports policy or the Khelo Bharat Niti 2025 with the national education policy of 2020. So what does it come to when you talk about each of these pillars? When you talk about national excellence on the global stage, the policy talks about developing talent pipelines and pathways which support athletes, find athletes at the talent identification stage, and take them all the way through to global competitiveness and success. This also is based on fundamental aspects such as physical literacy from early childhood, essentially the structure that gives people a propensity and a desire to move well and have the fundamentals of movement and play in place, but also extends to hosting major sports events, which boosts the competitiveness not just of our athletes, but also the nation as a brand, and also overall strengthening the ecosystem around sport, which furthers excellence. The second pillar is sports for economic development. And here we look at the role of sport in boosting tourism, manufacturing, livelihoods, and just the economic spur that can come from sport. And the policy hopes to establish a supportive environment for innovation, entrepreneurship, and the use of technology as well. When you look at the third pillar, the sports for social development pillar, this is an interesting one. For the first time, really elaborated in policy is the principle of inclusiveness, the role of inclusiveness for women, economically weaker sections, tribal communities, and persons with disabilities. So, much wider realm of inclusiveness in sport, but also looking at comprehensive talent development for underrepresented populations. So, looking at a much wider view of sport, sports excellence, as well as the talent pathways. But also, it talks about promoting sports diplomacy as a means of international engagement, and in some sense, fully exploring the social and economic developmental aspects of sport. Fourth is sports as a people's movement. This is an interesting one, which talks about making fitness and sports part of everyday life through mass participation programs and events. So, the objective here is to embed fitness and sport into educational institutions, but also in the daily lives, perhaps of workplaces, cities, transit systems, and all of the other things that keep people moving. We're a country which has a very poor scale on the WHO physical activity index, and certainly this pillar could help improve where we stand on those ratings. The fifth and final one is just harmonizing the sports policy with the education policy, which is the NEP 2020. And here it's about embedding sports into the education system from a holistic growth perspective, but also having a whole of school approach to physical education and adding, in some sense, physical literacy to the foundational aspects of literacy and numeracy and making it the third prong of education. So when we look at how to bring this to life, remains, if you were to do this as a corporate process in an OKR process, the objectives and key results. The national sports policy certainly sets out the objectives. The key results and how to get there and an implementation framework, I think, is still work in progress. And it is not something that this document necessarily talks about. But what it does specify is the need for strong governance and coordination mechanisms. And perhaps we will see the sports bill come to life in the coming weeks and months. It also talks about the role for technology in transforming the way we look at sport, the way we look at data, the way we monitor and evaluate programs, but also establishing what it calls clear goals and measurable progress. What it looks at is a whole of stakeholder and whole of ecosystem approach, which requires more private sector, civil society, and federation involvement. Also recognizing at the end of the day, sports is a state subject, and it needs states as well as the new union government to come together when you look at a national framework of everyone playing together towards common goals. So we know what our objectives are, the key results, and how to measure whether the sports policy is successful or not, I think remains a work in progress. It is reasonably complex because there's so many different stakeholders at the governmental level. You have federations, again, at multiple levels in the pyramid. You have civil society organizations and NGOs, and multiple different stakeholders on the corporate side, such as CSR funders, it could be sponsors, it could be investors, and everyone has to be taken along on this mission. How do you do this? And from a sports policy perspective, at the Sports and Society Accelerator, we've come up with this 7-layer stack for sports and physical activity, which encapsulates both excellence as well as participation, but establishes multiple requirements in between, which are in service of both excellence and participation. This includes governance, innovation, capacity, policy, and knowledge. So essentially, all of these play together in keeping these 5 pillars alive, which is excellence, economic development, social development, the people's movement, that is everyone participating in sport, as well as the integration of sports in education. So in that sense, the sports policy is a call to action for all of us. This is not something that the government is going to be able to implement alone, and should not be something that the government implements alone. The success of this policy is in how everyone else, not just the government, responds to this policy and comes together to play in what I would call a common team. Now, this is going to require the role of government to also change. So far, the government has been very much in implementation mode. When you look at the top scheme, you look at Khelo India, you look at Kirti, which is the talent identification scheme. This is all government in both design but also implement mode. Now, the government is going to have to find new ways of also interacting as regulator, as assessor, as funder of other projects. In some sense, also building ease of doing business and other things that make corporate involvement in sport more successful. And I think that is the call to action of the sports policy. I'm quite eager and excited to see how everyone responds to it and whether the government can play this leadership role in many new avatars. Look forward to the years ahead with this sports policy. I think it's a good start. It requires a lot of sort of dotting the I's and crossing the T's to bring it to life, but it's also each of our responsibility to make that process successful. Thank you for listening.